my name is Joe Jackson. I'm a journalist, author, interviewer, broadcaster, and documentarian. I also am someone who happens to have been fascinated by the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy ever since I was a child. Why wouldn't I be? Even though I live in Dublin, Ireland, my earliest memory of Kennedy is how excited my dad was when he became president. Likewise, in the Christian Brothers School in Dún Laoghaire, I heard from the age of 8 or so what a breakthrough it was in America that a Catholic of Irish descent had made it all the way to the White House. There was even a picture of President Kennedy on the wall in our schoolroom. In fact, many homes in Ireland had either or all 3 pictures of Jesus Christ, the Pope, and JFK. I saw him when he came to Ireland in 1963. I was standing in the crowd beside Trinity College when Kennedy's car passed en route to Leinster House, the seat of Irish government. I bought the Evening Herald newspaper soon afterwards because it included a free vinyl on cardboard record of his speech. My dad, Joe Jackson Sr., a lover of Irish literature and George Bernard Shaw in particular, was delighted when he heard that Kennedy had quoted, while in Leinster House, Shaw's line, "Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream of things that never were and say, why not?" And that quote made its way into my soul, which may account for the fact that 5 years later, when I heard a similar quote in Elvis's song If I Can Dream, it became my lifetime motto. As long as a man has the strength to dream, he can redeem his soul and fly. And of course, like millions the world over, I remember the night Kennedy died. I was out swapping comics, passing by the home of Alice Kennedy in our housing estate Edenvillis in Glasthule. Suddenly her front door burst open and she ran out screaming, "They've killed President Kennedy." Because of my home situation, which I need not go into here, I half lived in the fantasy world of comics and immediately thought, why didn't Superman save him? That response is not as nonsensical as it sounds. JFK was so much a part of popular culture that he'd made an appearance in a Superman comic. Early the following year, 1964, I bought another comic that I still own, a tribute to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It presented the official story that he was killed by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. But my dad never believed that story, and later again he told me that the Warren Commission was a lie. I even have vague memories of him showing me a Life magazine article in which there were pictures of 20 or so people who had contested the lone gunman theory and since mysteriously disappeared, been murdered, or committed suicide. He later read books on the subject and died believing that there was, if not mafia involvement in the assassination of Kennedy, then it was the work of the CIA, who had a second gunman in the grassy knoll, elsewhere in the vicinity, maybe a third, and possibly in the car in which Kennedy was assassinated. Like millions of people the world over, I've always wondered who in fact did order and have carried out the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The most recent dump of documents released on the orders of President Trump didn't conclusively answer that question, and apparently there are hundreds of papers the public have yet to see that apparently might. When all of this came back into the spotlight earlier this week, almost as a diversion to deflect from Trump's failure to get a ceasefire in Ukraine from Putin, I was reminded of a brace of interviews I did in 1990 with Irish author Anthony Summers and American filmmaker Oliver Stone, at the time of the release of the latter's movie JFK. I've decided to revisit them for a series of podcasts. If you want to read my articles, or at least these tapes, or any of my 1,400 tapes of interviews with celebrities, check out and contact me via my website, joejacksoninterviewer.com.
Correct the inaccuracies. It's important that we get the history lesson out there.
Right.
And it seems to me that gave him a certain responsibility to try to get over the truth. And what he's done is, in this sense, it's a little like Apocalypse Now, which started with a reasonably, I know it's not his movie, but which began with the first half, which to me, and no doubt to Stone, who was also in Vietnam, was a fairly faithful rendering of what it was like in Vietnam, whereas the second half is Joseph Conrad and total fantasy. This movie is, the first part of the movie which, which deals with the problems with the case, the inconsistencies in the evidence and the indications that there was conspiracy, that part of the movie is more or less accurate. Whereas the second part of the movie that deals with his notion that the motive for the conspiracy, the motive for murdering the president, had something to do with getting the nation further into the war in Vietnam, is absolute fantasy. And I find it very hard to forgive him for that. I keep getting letters at the moment from friends in the States that I've known for years who are delighted, as I am, that he has got dialogue going. In fact, we're talking about it here now. And of course that's worthwhile. But it seems to me that he didn't need to do that. And I, not for the tape, but I don't know whether you were listening on air or not this evening. But
I didn't know.
No, well, no, fine. Right. They asked me about that. I just didn't want to repeat myself. But the core movie audience apparently is people between 20 and 40.
Right.
And that means young people who were not around when it happened, at least not adults when it happened, and haven't been growing through the years of hearing the controversy about the assassination. And yet, in the oddest way, those people, and indeed my own children, seem to, not because they're my children, but and their friends, seem to be aware that the Kennedy assassination is a pivotal moment in modern times. But they don't know anything about it. Right. They know it's pivotal, they know things changed afterwards in some way, but they don't know about the assassination. Therefore, when he talks about telling the truth to the people through the movies, Stone is talking about trying to get over the facts, to give a history lesson, as he puts it, to that generation, and to tell them that this had something to do with Vietnam is I think, perverting history.
Do you think it's a manifestation of his obsession with Vietnam? The
Possibly.
Translation of
Well, possibly because of July, 4th of July. And so on.
That he has his own 60s bugbears that he believes.
Maybe, but it's time to grow up. It's a long time ago.
Right.
I was in Vietnam. I wasn't a soldier, but I don't have much patience, I'm afraid, with the whole deal of, the poor guy robbed a bank, and it's still going on. The guy robbed a bank or he did something violent. It's because he was in Vietnam.
Right. Everything's excused.
It's, you don't find that in the 1930s and 40s people were saying, oh, the poor guy was in the trenches on the Somme.
Right.
Wars are bad news. People get messed up by wars. Then there's a time to get over it and get on with other things. And you can't blame everything that's going on in America on Vietnam, and you certainly can't blame the Kennedy assassination on Vietnam. Of course it is possible that the motive for the Kennedy assassination was to do with the military and the industrial, the people that make the weapons, so-called the military-industrial complex, wanting to get into Vietnam, but there is no evidence for it, and that's the key thing that I was trying to get over on the program this evening, that there is as much evidence for that as there is for the notion that one of John Kennedy's many mistresses shot him from a helicopter with a bow and arrow. At least John Kennedy, we do know that John Kennedy had mistresses, right?
With bows and arrows.
But at least we know that he had mistresses. And there is not a shred of evidence. The Mr. X that you saw the movie, Mr. X that he has in the movie, everyone knows who Mr. X is. Mr. X is a guy called Fletcher Prouty, whom I interviewed first, I think, in 1977 or 8, who is a nice man who used to work, I think a little dotty, who used to work in the Pentagon, who had some interesting information about the U-2 program and whether or not the Gary Powers plane was deliberately programmed to be sent back to be shot down. But
He never met Garrison.
What?
He never met Garrison, did he? I mean, there was
I
no
don't think
such.
prior to he met Garrison at
Yeah.
all, no.
Yeah.
And of course the other thing we haven't touched on, which it sort of ceased to matter, but Garrison, as another, in terms of the younger generation in the United States, maybe everywhere, Kevin Costner is your clean-cut,
Sure.
young American hero
Capra-esque.
who can do no wrong. And whatever else he is, Jim Garrison is not that.
Sure.
Jim Garrison,
Right.
I contacted Jim Garrison in 1978, when I was making this film, to interview him. And I never forget him telling me on the phone that he thought, for security reasons, remember it's 1978,
Yeah.
so it's 15 years later, he said, for security reasons, I think we really should, we'd like to meet you in a steam bath. And I went to see the guy, and my impression that he was either a nutcase,
Okay.
or that he was a bad guy, or a combination of both.
Right.
And the Congressional Assassinations Committee discovered that at the time that he was running his investigation in 67 to 69 in New Orleans, during that period he was meeting with Johnny Roselli, who
Yeah.
was the right-hand man of Sam Giancana, who was certainly a mafia suspect
Sure.
in the assassination.
Yeah.
And going to Las Vegas and hobnobbing with him, which is something that the district attorney
Sure.
of New Orleans should no way in the world be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he has a very ambivalent world,
Right.
in the sense that in the sense that what Garrison did was to hold up the genuine interest and certainly journalistic interest in the Kennedy assassination for a vital decade, during which witnesses died and the trail got cold.
Right.
But he came onto the scene 4 years after the assassination, which was a time when it was still really possible to
Contact. All this.
to look into the thing properly.
Do you think that's the major?
And, I mean, when I said that I avoided it, one of the reasons that I avoided it was because of the farce of the Jim Garrison case,
Right.
which
Right.
was a farce. He is a risible character
Right.
at best, and
Right.
a sinister one at worst.
Right.
And yet you find that he has written somewhere that I'm a CIA agent.
Who you are?
Yes.
All right.
Not written it, he said it to
Right.
people in interviews that I'm a CIA
Right.
agent, because I suspect largely because I didn't mention him in my book when it first came out. 4 or 5 tiny references.
Right.
And Stone, in the same vein, while he was making the movie in Dallas, was sitting with a bunch of journalists and suddenly lashed out and called them all a bunch of CIA stooges and CIA agent journalists, so-called journalists, words to that effect. And of course, it is true that in the United States there have been journalists who are
Right.
used by the CIA, but most journalists aren't. They may be
Right.
boring, they may be creatures of the establishment, but they aren't CIA agents.
Right. Right.
And to say so is just silly.
Right.
But yeah, go on.
You have Garrison in the movie very much, and I'm accepting that a lot of our readers, 18 to 40 or 18 to 35, whatever they are, will accept as truth.
Yeah.
That is reality. Like, you have Garrison presented as this Capra-esque hero who argues down the involvement of the mafia. He says they haven't the guts, the money, the balls, or whatever it takes to be involved. Yet your book very much explores that they were a hugely influential factor in, and possibly the hitmen chosen were mafia people. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
But the movie's kind of playing down their role to almost non-existence.
Well, this has made a lot of people who studied the Garrison investigation wonder about Garrison, because of course he was the district attorney in a city run by Carlos Marcello. And there are great differences about whether Garrison as district attorney left the mafia alone or whether he pursued them. He would say that he pursued them, and he closed down clip joints and so on. There are others whom I have found more convincing, who suggest that actually he kowtowed to the mob. I don't know the truth because I've never run an investigation of Jim Garrison, but that is my impression. The fact is that Lee Harvey Oswald was in New Orleans for much of his young life before he went to, defected, in quotes, to Russia. And he was there for many of the months before the assassination, but his uncle, check the name, Dutz, I think, D-U-T-Z, Muret, M-U-R-R-E-T, was working in Marcelo's betting organization and the bookmaking side of things. That he was involved with a man called Guy Bannister. You know, have you got through my book?
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I have to assume that most of our readers are just...
Yes, okay, but I mean, you can mess with this.
Yeah.
That he was involved with a man called Guy Bannister who was let me back up.
All right, go ahead.
Mess with this, but I mean, let me back up. I mean, this is a hard thing to talk about like this.
Okay.
But I mean, Marcello had been one of the prime mafia targets of the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, and had been expelled from the country without ceremony months after the presidency began. And of all the key mafia bosses in the United States, was the one. They were all being prosecuted by the Attorney General, but he was the one with the most significant personal grudge because he had been kicked out of the country. And he was, at the time that the president was killed and for the months before it, having got back into the country, he was fighting a deportation order. And to fight the deportation order, he was using the services of a private investigator called Guy Bannister, a former FBI man, and a strange character involved with the anti-Castro movement called David Ferry. And both of them are now known to have been involved with Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin. And Marcello himself is known a year before the assassination to have threatened the life of the president and to have said that although his real persecutor was the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, that if you want to kill a dog, if a dog is biting you, it's no good cutting off the tail, meaning Robert Kennedy. If you want to stop the dog biting you, cut off the head, which in this case was John Kennedy. And there are so many indications following, that was September 1962, there are so many indications leading out of that into November 1963 that link Marcello or Marcello's people to either Oswald or the man who killed Oswald, Jack Ruby. That one has to suspect that Carlos Marcello was involved in some way in the assassination. But I don't. I want to stress that I don't think that the chief counsel of the Congressional Assassinations Committee, which, and I think we missed this when we were going around it the first time, which overturned the verdict of the Warren Commission and said that there was a probable conspiracy. Didn't. He said it's a historical fact, the mob did it. I would not want to be, having struggled through this material for so long, and having talked to a lot of the surviving people involved, I would absolutely not want to go along with that verdict. It seems to me that the fingerprints of intelligence are over Oswald to such a degree that that one has to allow for the possibility that people from US intelligence, rogue elements of US intelligence, absolutely not the CIA. Of course the CIA as a body didn't do it. There's too much nonsense about, paranoid nonsense about the CIA. The CIA is essentially a bureaucracy which is loyal to its current political masters, on the whole.
But didn't Robert Kennedy ask Did they? Didn't he ask the then
Yes,
director?
that, I mean, essentially the CIA is that.
Right.
But you have to back up and look at it in perspective that the Kennedys had come to power with a ready-made plan to invade Cuba, which happened at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, and they had been advised by the CIA that the invasion would work, and it didn't, and it was within 3 months of taking office, President Kennedy was humiliated, as Kennedys do not take kindly to being humiliated in that way, and he said privately that he'd like to scatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces, and one of the things he did was to appoint Allen Dulles, was to fire Allen Dulles and to appoint John McCone as the director.
Yeah.
But for the next couple of years, they were absolutely gung-ho to get rid of Fidel Castro, and I believe, and so do most historians now, that the Kennedys were aware of the plots that the CIA was carrying on to get rid of Fidel Castro, to assassinate Fidel Castro, using the mob, the mafia, to do it, and therefore there is no conflict in suggesting that the mob were involved with the CIA in the assassination, because the elements of both were involved together for many, many months before in the plots to kill Fidel Castro.
Right.
And both had their reasons for being very resentful indeed of John Kennedy, of the Kennedys. The mob, because they were being prosecuted, as we discussed, and and elements of the CIA, because for about 9 months before the assassination, Kennedy had given every sign of pulling out of the confrontation with Castro. October 1962, the year before, was the moment that I think the moment of truth for John Kennedy. It was all, up to then it was all gung-ho, let's go get him, let's do away with Fidel Castro, the confrontation thing, let's get back at what happened at the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
And then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think that was the moment at which John Kennedy really grew up politically. It was the moment that the world came closest to nuclear war. I was at university, and I remember when I and my friends and their girlfriends, holed up for 3 or 4 days because we thought the world was over and we'd better grab it now.
Right.
And that was slightly less than just over a year before the assassination.
Right.
And following that, in the months that followed, John Kennedy started pulling back from confrontation and starting to they were secretly training the XR groups to go in on raids against Cuba all the time. And Kennedy started cracking down on that, aborting raiding operations.
Yeah.
And indeed, in 2 or 3 days before he went to Dallas, he called in one of his UN ambassadors, and Atwood, I his first name, and said that he had been negotiating for many weeks previous to that to open talks, secret talks, with Castro's people.
All right.
And said, I will brief you. We want to go ahead with this. You will go on a secret mission to Cuba. I want to brief you in full on this, but first I have to go on a brief political trip to Dallas.
All right.
And of course he never came back.
Right, you mentioned the upcoming book Double Cross, which has since been serialised here in the Irish press last Sunday, and it alleges that Giancana was involved and that the CIA ordered the murder of Monroe.
I interviewed Sam Giancana, the nephew of the Giancana, 6 months ago, when the book was in the making. I think there's no doubt that he is indeed Sam Giancana's nephew, and that his father is Sam Giancana's half-brother.
Right.
Stepbrother. Yeah, a half-brother. My impression from reading the book, which I I don't think it's out here.
Not yet. No, we just got the
anyway,
first.
I had it from the States.
Okay.
My impression from reading the book is that the core of it is truthful, in the sense that it seems to me that the Sam Giancana did talk in confidence to his brother in generalities about his involvement in the Monroe matter and the Kennedy assassination. And I think that young Sam, who is quite a good writer,
Right.
Has done a lot of research and read books, possibly including my own, and has reached very much. And there's all the signs of embroidering it, which I think is a great pity.
Right.
The publishers contacted me during the work on the book and asked me about it, and I said that I thought it would be a good idea if they had somebody who knew the period to look at the manuscript to see whether there were any complete
Right.
howlers in it, and they didn't actually. The book has been published without anyone looking at it at all,
Right.
and I think that the authors may in the end regret it.
Right. So then you're saying that then that particular theory, because you've also written about Monroe killed by the CIA, yeah.
I feel I'm doing off the tape for a second.
Okay.
I feel I'm doing a lousy interview for you because it's such a complex story, and
We're trying to reduce it.
yes, I know you'll have a job, but the Monroe thing in my book, got it on
Yeah.
the Monroe thing. It was clear to me from the research that Robert Kennedy, that certain people were bugging Monroe and both the Kennedy brothers in their affair, that there was electronic surveillance going on, and that elements of the mob were involved in that. And there were rumors at the time, and indeed rather firm reports coming out of the Justice Department at the time to informed reporters that the mob had been involved, that when she died, the mob had been involved in attempts to set up Robert Kennedy.
Right.
Which is, going one better than slightly better
Sure.
than murder,
Right.
attempting to get him off their backs by hopelessly compromising him, and setting him up in a situation in which there would be the Attorney General of the United States with a dead Marilyn Monroe in the middle of the night in a Los Angeles suburb.
Yeah.
And she had spent a couple of weekends, including the weekend before her death, at the Cal Neva Lodge, which was a casino resort hotel north of Los Angeles, which was the secret part owner of which was Sam Giancana.
Yeah.
And she had known John Roselli, who was Sam Giancana's main henchman,
Mm-hmm.
for many years. So it seemed to me when I wrote my book in 1985 that if Monroe did not die naturally, then it was a reasonable thesis. The notion that Sam Giancana had been involved in her murder was a reasonable thesis. It was the one that made sense.
Okay.
The mob has done this in the
Right.
past, and therefore for Sam Giancana's half-brother to say this happened, to me, is an acceptable notion.
Okay.
On the other hand, if he and his son are trying to make a buck, it would be equally easy for them to read books and articles like mine and extrapolate from.
Right, but we also have seen, wasn't there a BBC documentary a couple of years back which did try and implicate Robert Kennedy in terms of that they would have known?
It was the documentary Say Goodbye to the President, which
Yeah.
was made, I did all the interviews in
Oh, right.
that film, and
Right.
it was made from my book,
Okay. Right.
in all but one of the interviews.
So, what if readers think like if you think the nearest approximation to the truth is that the mafia were involved in that one rather than Kennedy and John or CIA plotting that they had to silence her because she knew too much or was going to have this press conference or that stuff. Wasn't that to be part of the scenario? She was going to go public on some.
here I am living in a country that has so long worshipped the ground that John Kennedy worked on, walked on. And I have spent many years, working on the Kennedy case one way or the other, on the Kennedys' lives one way or the other. And so therefore I have, for my sins, contributed to the, what do you call it when you desaint someone?
Deshrining.
The deshrining, of the Kennedys.
Right.
It wasn't a plan, it was just the way the evidence took me. But although I think that they may well have known about and not shied away from plans to murder Fidel Castro, a foreign head of state,
right.
I would, from to the extent that I feel I know them at all, I would be utterly amazed if they ever had anything at all to do with considering plans to murder somebody with whom they were involved sexually or emotionally.
Right. Okay, but this desainting or deshrining of Kennedy maybe is something that people also need, because he did have the links with Giancana, who was a mass murderer, and they did use the mafia to get votes in certain constituencies. So surely, and you also have Stone's movie, which turns him back into the saint. This myth.
Well, that's the third reason.
You know what I mean?
Three reasons that I'm angry with. The three reasons that I am. Three things I regret about the Oliver Stone movie are the using Kevin Costner, Mr. Clean,
with a little bit of grey at the side too. I noticed that, like subliminal Kennedy image.
Yes. To portray a man who was, as I said earlier, at best cranky and kooky, and at worst a bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
The suggestion that in a film that supposedly brings the truth to the people, the suggestion that Vietnam was the motive for the murder, and thirdly, where were we?
I was saying about how Kennedy is now again being turned into the saintly figure.
Yeah, and thirdly, leaving Kennedy as the saint when you had, in Hollywood terms, you had every ingredient that you could possibly want for this. You had a president, mistresses, a mistress who is also sleeping with a mafia boss. There's no doubt about that. I mean, 3 or 4 months ago, I found the White House, I don't know if you saw the series I did on that, I found the White House logs that showed that Judith Campbell, one of his mistresses, had indeed been going in and out of the White House, just as she's claimed since 1976. We now have the telephone logs and the White House logs that show that she was doing that. We now have, since the book I did on the Monroe case, we have first-hand witnesses, next-door neighbors, people the kind of ordinary street witnesses that you just can't dismiss, rather than gossips. Absolutely establishing that both the brothers in their turn used Monroe as a plaything. And it's quite clear that John Kennedy used women in that way from before his marriage and during his marriage and right up into the presidency. And it's been called, the chief counsel of the Congressional Assassinations Committee called it his fatal flaw in the Greek tragic sense.
But you have Exner, and I mean, it very much comes across that Exner was also maybe carrying kind of documents and information that maybe were part of the Kill Castro.
She says she was. There's no establishing that.
There's no way to establish the truth.
She says that she was carrying packages that she never looked inside them. Why would she? She thought she was a very young woman, 24 I believe, and she was honoured to be carrying packages for John Kennedy. She did not at the beginning have any notion that Giancana was even a mafioso.
And maybe money wasn't a suspicion that it was also
before the presidency money. To help subvert the election process, particularly in West Virginia, and then further packages. It was briefcases before the presidency began, during the primary campaign. And then after the presidency began, it was packages. She was asked to carry these, and she flew around the country on many occasions with packages. She understood, and he said to her, that it was to do with her quote of him, the elimination of Fidel Castro.
Right.
Giancana's brother says that packages were carried that contained FBI surveillance reports of Giancana. In other words, that the president was sending Giancana FBI documents.
Right.
That, in other words, to suggest to him, you know, as a reward for the services that you have rendered, I am giving you, Sam Giancana, mafia boss, I'm making you aware of the way in which the FBI is covering you, which allows you to make your own arrangements. And that Sam Giancana subsequently realized that, in fact, he was only being sent part of the coverage, which made him feel that he was being too timed.
All right.
Now,
that's the double cross element.
Which, yes.
Right.
Now, this may sound extraordinarily far-fetched. Would Kennedy indeed be doing this? It sounded far-fetched to me. On the other hand, we have the verbatim FBI transcripts of Giancana talking as though he was being too timed. He doesn't talk about that specific matter.
Right.
And you have Santos Trafficante, who was one of the three mafia bosses. There were three mafia bosses in the United States of major significance that matter in this story. Sam Giancana of Chicago, Santos Trafficante in Florida, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans. And you have Santos Trafficante talking about, a witness reporting Santos Trafficante talking in late 1962 about these Kennedys, they do not keep a bargain.
It's going to be hit.
They do not keep a bargain. They take graft. This is the key thing. They take graft.
And they don't.
And they do not keep a bargain. And then when the fellow he's talking to said, well, I think he's going to be elected in 1964, he said, no, mark my words, he's going to be hit.
Right.
And so you have you have this extraordinary assertion now from Sam Giancana's brother, but it is not out of tune with the things that we know are real FBI's, either FBI surveillance transcripts or what witnesses talking to these mafia people.
Hi, Joe Jackson here again. I thank you for listening to this edition of the Joe Jackson Interviews podcast. And don't forget, if you want to check out what are the other taped interviews I have that are available to lease or listen to or whatever, or read my articles, go to joejacksoninterviewer.com.